Welcome to yet another season of FutureDAMS webinar series. Today we have Barnaby Dye with us. He's a postdoctoral research associate with the FutureDAMS Research Consortium, and that's here at the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester. His doctorate is from Oxford, where he was in the Department of Politics, and his background is in geography. He's interested broadly in the politics of development with specializations in Africa and dam building, particularly in Rwanda and Tanzania. Also interested in the increasing role of India and Brazil in Africa. And within the FutureDAMS Consortium, he's working on dam building in India, Ghana, and Ethiopia. And today his presentation is titled Meeting Africa's Latest Dam Builders, the India ExIm Bank, Entrepreneurial Companies, and the Outcomes of SouthSouth Cooperation. On to you, Barnaby.
Many thanks, Roshan. I'll just share my screen now. Yeah, so I'm Barnaby Dye, part of this FutureDAMS project at the University of Manchester. And today I'm going to be talking about the rise of India as a financier and builder of dams in Africa. So this story starts on the 5th of March in 2014 when the Rwandan president here, pictured Paul Kagame, inaugurated one of the largest post-genocide projects in Rwanda, the Nyabarongo Dam. But what this picture leaves out is the significance for another group of actors, because it was India who had financed this project and two Indian contractors who were in charge of its construction, Angelique International and BHEL, whilst the Indian Export-Import Bank, which is a government bank, had provided 80% of the finance for the dam for a subsidised line of credit scheme. And this isn't alone. This Nyabarongo project isn't alone. It was one of a number of dams financed by the Indian ExIm Bank since the scheme started a decade and a half ago. So there's been a couple of dams in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of which was completed last year, and the other which is nearly nearing completion. Similarly, in Burundi, there's a dam which is nearing completion. In Zambia, the ExIm Bank financed part of a private sector bank initiated by Tata Africa. And in the Central African Republic, two hydropower dams are on hold because of ongoing violence there. And so this is significant because it shows how India has been a contributor to a wider trend in Africa, where there's been an increase in the number of dams being built since mid-2000s, where a number of dams, you can see in the yellow dots here, have been planned over the last 2 decades, and many of them have started to be constructed. And whilst our attention has mostly been on China, which has been the major funder and builder of these sort of 21st century dams on the continent, this clearly shows that India has also played a part and needs to be recognized as part of that bigger picture. And so for this presentation today, I'm looking at the sort of actors and the agency of who's driven India's dam building in Africa and the consequences of that particular configuration of actors for those projects. A little caveat here is that I'm really looking at this line of credit regime up till 2015, at which point there was a significant rule change that India introduced, which I've also written about, or I'm writing about, I should say, and I'm happy to talk about more in the Q&A if people are interested in that. But my argument here is that Indian companies have really been in the driving seat for dams in Africa. Indian companies have been the ones engaging in a lot of governments on the continent, getting involved in projects, and therefore they've had a significant role in shaping the way dams have been built. But alongside Indian firms, we shouldn't forget the significant role that African governments have. That they've also been the ones wanting to pursue these projects, and they also have the most significant role perhaps in determining how they get built. But the interesting thing is the contrast then between those African governments, Indian companies, and the Indian government, which seems to play a much more background enabling role. And this reflects its interests, which are far broader and sort of follow typical sort of foreign policy goals, which really make it focus more on governments in Africa. But the relationship there is, that they're interested in is one that's very state to state, as opposed to thinking about the citizens or the developmental outcomes of the projects they engage in. And this position is also reinforced by ideas of South-South cooperation. And so I explore this, the consequences of that with regards to a particular project in Rwanda, this Nyabarongo Dam, and look at the positives that India's engagement brought for this project, but also some of the negative consequences of this quite sort of open-ended state-to-state relationship. So just to give a little bit of background to India's rise in Africa, it's really started in the economic boom that India had in the 1990s, where the economy opened up. And this allowed a number of companies, India's large conglomerates, to internationalize, often with the support and help of some of the major trade organizations, the private sector organizations in India, the Confederation of Indian Industries, and FICCI also, which logos pictures there. And they were quite significant in organizing delegations, conducting research over business opportunities in Africa, holding conferences, and their work was supported a bit from the government from 2002 with the Focus Africa scheme. But the key here is that a lot of this agency, a lot of the impetus to go to Africa is coming from the private sector and from these private sector federations. And so the 1990s and 2000s saw a number of companies go to Africa quite independently, whether that's in agriculture with companies like Kiloska, who do irrigation pumps, in the automobile sector with Tata, with Ashok Leyland, or in mining, again with Tata, companies like ArcelorMittal and Vedanta. There's also some service sector companies that have gone to Africa as well. But we can see here the important role of Indian companies in pushing a lot of this relationship with the continent. And government is then takes a sort of slightly slower, more gradual approach. Its first sort of deliberate engagement in Africa came with the 2008 India-Africa Forum Summit, which was held in Delhi, followed up by another one in 2011 in Addis Ababa. But both of these conferences were quite small. They only brought together 15 African states under the so-called Banjul formula. And so the first sort of really large-scale, lavish, high-level political event happened in 2015 with the third summit in Delhi. And there, all countries in Africa were invited for the first time, and there was really a lot of lavish sort of red carpet treatment. And since then, we've seen that interest follow up with regular visits from the president, vice president, and prime minister of India to Africa. And slowly, there's also been an increase in embassies and other sort of on-the-ground diplomatic efforts. And so this sort of again paints this picture of government sort of having a more gradual approach where the private sector is perhaps leading, and the private sector seems to have a lot more independent agency in this Africa relationship. But how to explain the Indian government's interest that's sort of slowly been increasing? For the private companies, it's quite clearly straightforward sort of profit motives that have led them to Africa. But what is the interest for Indian government? Well, a lot of these are quite sort of straightforward international foreign policy objectives that a lot of the other emerging powers also share with India. Africa, so the first of these is around the votes in international forum and for the reform of international multilateral institutions. Africa tends to vote as a bloc in things like trade or climate change agreements. And so India is seeking those votes for its agenda for reform, whether that's reform of the UN Security Council, whether it's about its sort of agenda within trade or other multilateral engagements. So alongside that interest is one in natural resources in Africa. And particularly here, oil has been quite significant and other energy supplies, because India has quite a sort of strong international dependence on its energy resources. It has to import most of its oil. And so it was seeking to diversify the origin of where it was getting its oil from. And so it wanted to build up relations with some of the African states which during the 2000s were discovering oil. Think of countries like Angola or even more recently Ghana and Uganda. And another element here was an interest in building a sort of sphere of influence around the Indian Ocean. But India is keen to build close ties with its neighboring states, and also has some sort of worry about China's increasing role both within the Indian Ocean and in Africa, which India regards as an area where it's had former influence. And so it doesn't want to lose ground to China in those areas. And this all came together to underpin the line of credits subsidy scheme. So it's run by the state Indian Export-Import ExIm Bank, and involves subsidizing government-to-government loans. And this was important because it allows a building of relations with African states, where essentially India is able to give them money for the projects that they want to build. And so this was seen as an important diplomatic instrument. But another key influence for these, as well as these sort of strategic interests, another key influence for these Indian ExIm Bank loans comes from SouthSouth Cooperation. And this refers to a group of ideas which have their origin in the non-aligned movement. And that is a movement that grew in the Cold War era, where a number of newly independent countries wanted to become, didn't want to sort of fall into the binary of the Cold War, and wanted to create a sort of alternative third bloc. And so built a sort of set of principles and international relations between these new independent countries, which would inform the way they interacted with each other and sort of try to create solidarity within a new bloc. And so the key principles here are around equality between these non-aligned countries, which partly involves the idea of win-win partnerships. This is the idea that both sides are going to try and benefit from any cooperation activities. And that sort of win-win idea is very different from a traditional aid idea, where the recipient is the one who's supposed to benefit, not the giver of aid, not the donor. Relatedly, there's an idea of sort of what you could call sovereignty first, the idea that you need to sort of fundamentally respect the recipient state's supreme rights to determine the policies and what's going on in their country. Then there's another related idea there about non-conditionality, but unlike sort of Western donors and the so-called Washington Consensus, sort of South-South Cooperation wouldn't impose any rules and regulations around what that cooperation would entail and how it should be used. And another idea accompanying these is one of having demand-led cooperation. That is, where the recipient is requesting these cooperation, this sort of development, solidarity, if you like, rather than India coming in and saying, this is what you should be doing, this is what we think needs to happen here. So that's sort of more of a demand-led, more of a recipient shaping that engagement. And all of these principles then informed the way in which the ExIm Bank process worked, which I tried to sort of schematically sketch out here. And what I really want you to pay attention to here is the way in which the political approval at the top right of the screen comes before assessment of the project which the Indian Export Bank line of credit is going to fund. And so what the Indian government is assessing whether they should give a loan based on a state-to-state relationship, rather than basing it on an assessment of the project itself. And this is especially true pre-2010. In 2010, they introduced a slight change to the way these loans were organized by mandating that there was a detailed project report. So before 2010, there wasn't even, just to recap, the ExIm Bank loan started it really got going in 2004. And so between 2004 and 2010, there really wasn't much assessment of the projects themselves. And in 2010, they mandated this detailed project report, but it in reality was often very sketchy. And they only really had the capacity to assess such reports from 2012, when they introduced what is called the DPA, the Development Partnership Authority, which sits within the Ministry of External Affairs, the MEA. And so what we see here is really, and if there is any emphasis on the project themselves, it's about trying to improve that project, just trying to sort of increase its feasibility, increase its a little bit of its detail, but the project itself is never relevant to whether the loan should go ahead or not. And this can also be demonstrated by the way in which a lot of the ExIm Bank loans were clumped together. So you can see, if you look through the ExIm Bank records, that there'll be a loan to a country which may include such diverse things as railway carriages, irrigation systems, and some power equipment. And these are all clumped together, and so essentially what's happening there is the loan is being offered or agreed upon first, and then its content comes much later. And finally, there's up until 2015, not very much monitoring of the projects which are agreed. And this is significant because it allows the rise of 4 particular companies. And these are the sort of the labels I put here: as Angelique, Overseas Infrastructure Alliance, Jaguar Overseas, and Lucky Exports. And these companies are significant because they haven't, before the lines of credit scheme, they hadn't really been involved in infrastructure projects. And some of them only started after the line of credit scheme got going. So, for example, Angelique International had previously been supplying school books to a part of UN, of Kurdistan that was controlled by the UN in the 1990s. The Overseas Infrastructure Alliance only started once the funders realized the opportunity that the line of credit scheme offered. And so these 4 companies grew from very little to really having a dominating role over the infrastructure projects being built in Africa. And we're competing with some of the more established Indian firms that were also growing because of the ExIm Bank loans, chiefly Shapoorji and Pallonji. It's now subsidiary Afcons, and then the main state company, there's BHEL, Bharat Heavy Electricals. And the way in which these companies managed to get such a large share of the ExIm Bank loans was by their own sort of, you could call it entrepreneurialism, where in this sort of top left of the diagram here, the Indian companies themselves are going out and pitching projects to governments based on what they think they may be interested in, or presenting unsolicited bids for existing projects that they know governments want to do. And when they did such bidding and sort of pitching to governments, they could always promise that the ExIm Bank money could come in if that recipient's African state wanted it to. And this was because even up till today, as far as I'm aware, no request for an ExIm Bank line of credit has ever been rejected by the MEA. So essentially, because of those sort of political interests in building ties of Africa, the ExIm Bank and the Ministry of External Affairs, who has the political approval, has never turned down request from an African government for such a loan. And so how does this affect individual projects? So to answer that question, we return back to this Nyabarongo Dam in Rwanda. This, in many ways, fits the sort of typical pattern that I've outlined for how a lot of these ExIm Bank projects worked, with Angelique really playing the sort of pivotal key role. So they were the ones who went to the government in Rwanda and offered their services to build the project, made it clear that they could bring in the ExIm Bank finance, and so they were able to outcompete the other offers on the table, which were more from European development donor partners. And so this is significant, as I sort of laid out at the beginning, because it's the first Indian-built dam in Indian financed and built dam in Africa, but it's also first for the companies involved. For Angelique, this was the first time they were leading the civils works on a project. So simultaneously to their negotiating the Nyabarongo Dam, Angelique had started on a dam in Afghanistan called the India-Afghan Friendship Dam. But here it was one of two subcontractors doing the civils work. And by civils work, I mean the sort of physical concrete dam wall and that sort of thing. In that project, Angelique wasn't doing the dam wall, they were doing some other parts of that project. And so this was the first time they were leading a large project on the civils work, let alone a large dam. Partly to sort of mitigate that, the Rwandan government placed BHEL as the overall project managers. But this was also important for BHEL because they normally only do what's called the electromechanical components, which are the turbines and the sort of generation structure itself. And so they don't normally manage a whole project. So this is their first time managing a large dam project. And so for both companies, but particularly Angelique, they had to undergo a rapid recruitment drive in order to bring in the experience and just create a workforce to undertake this sort of project. The Rwanda government were quite savvy in mitigating against some of the inexperience of these firms. They appointed RSW, which was taken over during the course of the project, but is a large, well, it was an experienced Canadian engineering company, and they were the owner's engineer, which means the sort of on-site overseers making sure the project is going according to plan. And also the Snowy Mountain Australian company, Snowy Mountain Corporation, which is again very experienced, did the actual design for the dam. So what are the benefits of this project at a national level? Well, the Nyabarongo hydropower project is the largest power plant in Rwanda and its primary backup for the power system. It's also the cheapest electricity plant by kilowatt hour. And the fact that Indian companies and finance was involved was advantageous for Rwanda for two reasons. One of which was that the contractor's bid was much cheaper than the sort of European competitors that were also in the mix in the early stages of the project. And also the Rwandan officials liked the fact that there was less bureaucracy involved, that there was less sort of planning processes to go through, less, whether that was about sort of bidding documents or later on with monitoring. There were also benefits at the local level to people's livelihoods in that valley. So the contractors decided to procure what they could locally, and mainly for their canteens. And so they bought vegetables and things off the villagers in the area. They also provided local jobs. So at the peak of the dam construction, a third of the sort of full-time staff were Rwandan, and in addition to that, they also employed casual day labour from the local area. And by the end of the project, the majority of workers on the site were Rwandan, a lot of the Indian labour having returned. In addition, and perhaps more uniquely to the Indian contractors, the workers and managers on site were very happy to buy from local establishments, shops and bars. And so this overall sort of procurement and employment created something of a sort of small economic bubble in the area. This is slightly captured by, somewhat captured by one of the participants who I interviewed, who drew this map of the village in the previous slide around the main dam site. And they showed here that there was a new road which was constructed, which wasn't there before. It was just a small dirt path. A number of new houses that had been built, including a lot of shops and bars. And so for this one village, there were some particular benefits. And these were somewhat spread around the valley, but there was a geographical concentration in the local livelihood benefits from the project. And there was also a social concentration, if you like, amongst those who had more assets, who didn't have as many caring responsibilities, who were young enough to work, and who were able to put in manpower on their land to grow more vegetables, to grow more produce to sell. And so you do see some local level benefits, but those are limited socially and geographically. There are also a number of negative impacts which came from the way in which this dam was governed. On the technical level, a lot of these were to do with the lack of surveys that had been done beforehand. Here, the first of these is around topography, where it seems like an inadequate topography study was conducted before the dam was constructed, because the reservoir turned out to be several kilometers longer than anticipated, resulting in a rapid compensation process once they started filling the dam. Additionally, there was issues around sediments. The Nyabarongo River has a very high sediment load, but engineers involved frequently sort of dismissed this concern, saying that sluice gates in the dam wall would be able to solve that problem. However, 2 years after the dam was constructed, the reservoir had silted up to quite a large level, and the Rwanda government has had to start using a dredger in that reservoir, as well as implementing an anti-erosion policy in the catchment. Another issue was around hydrology, where reportedly some engineers, after the dam was constructed, reported that the hydropower station didn't have enough water to run at full capacity all the time, and certainly there hadn't been a sort of updated hydrology study before construction had started. I think they were relying on a study done in the early 1990s. Additionally, there was issues around environmental management. So during the project, before the project, there hadn't been an environmental impact assessment done or environmental management study done. And so there were issues with soil dumping and oil spills that occurred during the project. The newly created Rwandan environmental agency had only really got going halfway through the project. And so it tried to impose a regime on how the environment was on environmental management, impact management. But this, only really started halfway through the project. Additionally, there were issues around construction, partly because of the lack of experience of both companies, but particularly Angelique. There wasn't a system for quality management in the civil side of the project. And so the owner's engineer, for example, in their completion report, repeatedly raised the issue of quality construction, and reported several times that they ordered sections of work to be redone, and saw that they sort of blamed this on the lack of a quality control system within Angelique's corporate structure. There were also a number of local impacts which stemmed from the from the project. So as I sort of said before, there wasn't an environmental impact assessment done before the project. This meant that issues like downstream impacts are very much unknown. And the impact assessments that were done were primarily around working out which people needed to be compensated. So the Rwanda government did run a compensation scheme, but there was quite a few implementation issues, partly around corruption, which were solved after the first couple of rounds of compensation. But there were also still farmers and landowners in the area being missed out. So the top right picture there shows a farmer showing where his land was, which had been taken over by a blast site to get stone to build this, to create the cement, but he hadn't received any compensation for his farm. And then there were a series of other impacts which were left uncompensated. And these primarily came from the process of construction, which hadn't been considered as part of that impact assessment. So one area here was that some of the streams in the area were being blocked, and these streams had been important for particular livelihoods, which, for example, growing tomatoes, which are a bit more water intensive. There's also a lot of concerns created by this quarry site where rocks were falling on people's houses in the area, or the shaking from the blast would also crack were cracking houses for quite a wide radius, and the stones were also falling on people's fields and damaging crops. But none of those impacts were recognized officially and compensated by the project. So I think this demonstrates the openness of Indian dam finance, if you like. Its lack of conditions and the absence of standards, particularly up to this 2015 rule change. Afterwards, we have seen a change. And that's informed partly by SouthSouth Cooperation principles, which are really trying to give a lot of independence to the recipient, but also about India's strategic foreign policy interests, which sort of mandate a focus on government-to-government relations. But the political drive for these line of credit schemes is really about building those closer ties. They're not about thinking about the development outcomes of a project or about the citizens of a country, as that's the responsibility for the recipient in this sort of South-South framework. And so the openness of this Indian dam finance obviously created a number of important impacts, one of which was the way in which it allowed these companies, these 4 inexperienced companies, to take such a large share of the line of credit scheme. And that had some positives in terms of allowing lower bids for projects, allowing infrastructure to be built cheaper, but also created problems, as we've seen, around construction standards, and also around environmental and sort of social impacts. But we can't forget the role of African governments here. They're the ones who decide these dams are going to be built, and in many ways the South-South framework is giving them the responsibility for how dams then should be built and how impacts should be managed. And I think what's interesting here is that we do see a pattern of positives and negatives, but a lot of the negatives seem to be repeating some of the mistakes of more controversial 20th century dams, whether that's about not measuring impacts, not doing a lot of studies beforehand, whether that's about missing the negative social impacts and not compensating them, whether that's about missing opportunities to really spread benefits across the whole community and focus on restarting livelihoods once a project's been completed. Those, at least in this first round of dams in Rwanda and being financed by India, seem to have not happened, and the lessons that we know from international reviews, such as the World Commission on Dams or some of the work done by the International Hydropower Association, don't seem to be affecting the way in which these Indian dams are being constructed in Africa, particularly. So I hope you found that interesting, and I look forward to your questions.
I'd just like to thank everyone for attending, and I will note that we're taking a break now. We started this when the lockdown thing started, and I think we've done 6 so far. The months have just zoomed by, sort of. So we've got Alvaro Rivera, Dr. Alvaro Rivera from UCL, scheduled for the 8th of September. So a couple months break, but in the meantime, please go to our website. It's www.futuredams.org to stay updated on our research and our papers and everything else. And thank you so much again, Barnaby, for sharing your work.
That's okay. The sort of basis of this presentation should be out in the working paper some point in the next couple of months. So you can look out for that.
Awesome. All right. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.